Hello, and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we cultivate tomorrow by inspiring agripreneurs and ag innovators through real-life perspectives in agriculture. I'm Paul Windemuller, your host on this journey of exploration and growth. On today's episode, we feature Donald Moore, who is the Executive Director for Global Dairy Platform, which is a group that represents pre-competitively some of the largest players in the dairy industry around the world. Now, Donald has had an extensive career in agriculture around the world. He travels extensively around the world, even to this day. And he is probably one of the most well-connected people that I know in the dairy industry globally. On today's interview, I got to pick his brain about some of the insights that he has going on around the world today in the global dairy industry. And we will also hear a little bit more about being connected and the role that that's played in his career over the last 25 years in the dairy industry. So here's today's interview with Donald Moore. Donald Moore, welcome to the AgCulture Podcast. It's great to have you on today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Paul. I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
I am too. Donald and I first met in October of 2023 at the Global Dairy Platform Summit in Chicago. I believe that was right.
That's right. It was called Nourish.
Yep, the Nourish Conference. And Donald, you're the Executive Director for a very unique group in dairy called the Global Dairy Platform. You want to tell us a little bit more about what that organization is and also how you got started in your dairy journey?
Well, that's a long journey, but let me start with Global Dairy Platform. Global Dairy Platform was formed back in 2006 by four of the world's largest dairy cooperatives, and that was Dairy Farmers America from here in the U.S., Arla Foods from Denmark, Campina, now called Friesland Campina from the Netherlands, and Fonterra Cooperative Group from New Zealand. And the CEOs of those four organizations met in Melbourne, Australia, and they had a discussion, and they said, look, there are a lot of things that we compete on in the global marketplace, but there are a number of challenges and indeed perhaps some opportunities that are pre-competitive. And wouldn't it be a good idea if rather than competing on those, we combined efforts and forces to address them collectively? So that was our formation back in 2006. We've now got around 100 members worldwide in, I think, 37, 38 countries. And then they have businesses in about 150, 160 countries around the world. So that's, sort of the background to Global Dairy Platform, very much working in that pre-competitive space. For me, I will often say this to people, I'm a relative newcomer to dairy. I've only been in the dairy industry 24 years. So I've been at Global Dairy Platform for 14 years now. And then prior to that, I spent 10 years with Fonterra Cooperative Group down in New Zealand. My last job there was the head of ingredient marketing. Prior to that, I ran their business development function for ingredients. And before that, I ran the ingredients business in Australia and New Zealand. But so prior to the dairy industry, because I'm a little older than you, Paul, I also had a number of years in the consulting world, and I was CEO of a consulting firm for 10 years prior to that as well.
Great. Well, it sounds like a pretty rich history to get you to where you are today. With the scale of the members of Global Dairy Platform Group and them being, multinationals and really large-scale cooperatives around the world. What's that like, kind of being the tip of the spear for that group?
It is absolutely fascinating. So our board is not just the CEOs of those four companies that we started out with, but on our board we've also got the president and chairman of Saputo from Canada, the president and CEO of Leprino Foods from here in the United States. We've also got the president, I think it is, of Morinaga Milk Industries in Japan, and the CEO of China Mengniu Dairy Company from China. So we've got 8 CEOs who sit around our boardroom table, and you would think that would create quite a lot of politics. Yet actually, to the contrary, these guys are really good at establishing what is that pre-competitive layer of activity and making sure we focus on that. And, everything we do has to be done under antitrust. So we need to make sure we never stray into areas of competition. But there's something I think is relatively unique about the dairy industry, Paul, and that is that at its very basic level, at its very fundamental level, dairy is a cooperative function. No one farmer can typically afford the technology or the equipment to process their own milk. So they've always banded together. And that cooperative ethos flows right up to our board table, even though we've got these 8 CEOs from big companies all over the world that do compete with each other. They actually find a way to collaborate as well.
Could you tell the audience a little bit about some of the projects that Global Dairy Platform has worked on? Give us some of those examples.
Sure. So when I joined Global Dairy Platform, one of the biggest challenges we had at the time was around milk fat. And you might remember way back, and this is like 15 years ago, sort of the common perception at the time was saturated fat was causing heart disease. Milk contains saturated fat, ergo milk is contributing to heart disease. Now, there wasn't actually a lot of scientific evidence to support that position, but it was generally believed by everyone. It led to, nutrition guidelines, dietary guidelines around the world, limiting the amount of saturated fat in the diets and so on. And so one of the first things we dealt with at Global Dairy Platform was bringing the global industry together to do the research around the implications of consuming saturated fat from dairy. And nowadays, most of the scientific literature out there talks about dairy having a protective effect. So that was kind of like really early days. Moving on from there, of course, as an industry, we got quite concerned around the question of sustainability, and Global Dairy Platform launched a program called the Dairy Sustainability Framework, where we still track and report on sustainability in the global dairy sector. We have around 52%, I think it is, of all the formal milk in the world reporting through that framework. Covers 11 criteria from economic to social to environmental outcomes. For many years, the number one issue in that program was, the number one priority for the people responding to it was around greenhouse gas emissions. Last year, for the first time ever, animal care just pipped it at the post. So animal care is now the number one issue priority. So that was the Dairy Sustainability Framework. More recently, we launched a program called Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, which is a global program for the dairy sector, looking at how do we reduce emissions from dairy, and in particular, I guess, with all the emphasis and focus on methane that came out of the launch of the Global Methane Pledge and others, we've really got, we've got our work cut out there in terms of building this program that covers all dairy systems, all dairy types in the world, and coming up with solutions and different pathways to how we can reduce those emissions from dairy. So those are kind of like maybe some of the big things we're working on. The other thing this is more nascent, something we're starting to build at the moment, and that is that we do a lot of work in Global Dairy Platform representing the dairy sector at UN activity. And in the last few years, we've been seeing a slight shift in the attitude at the UN Climate Change Summit, the COP meetings, towards agriculture and livestock. And at the COP last year in Dubai, they launched a thing called the Emirati Declaration, signed by 157 countries, where they're saying for the first time ever that, we need to solve climate change within the context of solving nutritional security, livelihoods, economic growth. So that, we think, is a major shift in position, and therefore presents us with an opportunity as dairy to get more actively engaged in what is the narrative about food and agriculture, and therefore the role for dairy in a much more positive way than has happened in the past. So that's a little bit about what we're up to at the moment, Paul.
Well, it sounds like you guys have a lot of influence on what goes on behind the scenes in dairy globally, which is very important to have somebody really working hard on behalf of dairy farmers, dairy processors, and again, bringing that all together at one point. So through that, obviously that takes a lot of relationship management and having great connections throughout the industry, throughout the world. And I know you're a very well-connected person. So could you talk to us a little bit about the importance to you of being well-connected and establishing good relationships and what that's done over the course of your career?
Yeah, so many, many, many years ago in the 1980s and then early 90s, I worked for, a computer vendor as a salesman. And one of the things I learned about sales from way back then is people buy from people. And I don't think that's changed today. And so the interpersonal relationships are absolutely fundamental to getting anything done. So, writing a really great academic paper is one thing. Getting people to actually, listen to what it says and make a change is quite something else again. And so the need for us to actually engage in that direct communication with people is really, really important. Now, it does mean a lot of travel. It means a lot of time away. It means an awful lot of time on the cell phone or on the phone just generally, not on email. People think that email is communicating. Email's not communicating. Email is a good way to record something you've already agreed on. But what we really need to do, if we're going to change people's hearts and minds, we've got to get in front of them. And sadly, there's no better way to do that than go and visit them. And, until such time as we have holographic, technologies or whatever, I think it means, a lot of air miles, frankly.
Yeah. And doing that, going to where that person is, whether that be a different country or even, going from an office setting to a farm setting, and getting into somebody's environment that really helps you understand where they're coming from, right?
Absolutely. One of the things I'd say is that, I remember when we first started engaging with the UN, which is maybe 10 years ago now, where we actively developed a program to engage with the UN. We went along to these meetings thinking that they would already understand what dairy was all about. Man, were we surprised. They had absolutely zero idea. And the people who were influencing their idea about the dairy sector at the time were largely NGO type groups who really had something of an anti-dairy bias. But even those people, you got to spend time with those that have a different point of view. And, I often say to people, it's very hard for somebody to hate you once they get to know you. It's very easy for them to form, quite firm and negative views about you and your industry until they have to sit down across the table with you and discuss the actual detail. And, one of the things that we in GDP pride ourselves on is that we do everything based upon evidence, scientific evidence, etc. And, so there again, if you turn up to the meetings and you've got the evidence from your dairy sustainability framework, or you've got the evidence from UN reports written about dairy and poverty or dairy and hunger or whatever it might be, you've got evidence. It's very hard for somebody to claim that it's not true.
That's a great point. And I think that's one, especially as farmers, we forget. We just think everyone should understand what we do and the product that we make and that it's good for you. And I know I've been shocked to talk to consumers or talk to people that are creating policy around stuff that affects us directly and as dairy producers or dairy processors. And like you said, they have no idea how it actually is in the real world of what we're dealing with day to day until you sit down and get to know them and talk to them about it.
Yeah. And remember, they're paid to make policy. So even if they don't have the data or the science or the evidence, they're going to make policy. And then sometimes, a bit like the milk fat story, sometimes the hardest thing for us then is to back out bad policy and replace it with good, because people get pretty committed to what they've already done. So it can be quite difficult for us to change them at that point.
That's a great point. That's a very good point. You didn't think about policy making like that. They get paid to make policy no matter if it's good or bad, right?
Well, they get paid to make policy. And then, when you come to them later on with evidence that contradicts that policy, it can be a little hard for them to accept the need to change it. And sometimes it needs a generational shift before, which is where we're at, I think, at the moment with milk fat. Dietary guidelines in certain countries still limit the amount of saturated fat intake. And nowadays, when you talk to those regulators or policy people, they say, "Oh, we still need to limit it because of the calories." So they find a way to keep it in there, and it's going to take a change in people before we see a change in policy in some areas.
Well, I think we're seeing that change in the market now with the way fat is priced. At least here in the U.S., it's been kind of the shining star of dairy, helping to hold our prices together.
Yeah, that's global too. It's not just here in the U.S. That's a global trend, and and I think people are starting to recognize it for flavor as well as it's not that negative health impact that people had thought. And we're starting to see that a lot of these products that have been formulated to remove fat, but still maintain mouthfeel and taste, etc., have actually got more negative health outcomes than the original product that was trying to replace.
Right. That's exactly right. So, Donald, what are some of the biggest challenges that you still see out there in dairy globally?
So I mentioned before, Paul, that we launched this program, Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. We've been under a lot of pressure in the dairy sector about our environmental impact, and in particular, greenhouse gas emission reductions, or the amount of greenhouse gas that we put into the environment. So if you think about the global methane pledge, when it launched, dairy is about 8% of anthropogenic methane emissions in the world. So around 60% of emissions are coming from fossil fuel and other sources, about 40% from agriculture. Of that 40%, dairy is 8%. By the way, rice is also 8%. And the other 24% tends to be mostly from other livestock sources like, beef in particular. So we launched this program, Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, back in 2021, and we did it on the back end of a report we prepared with FAO and published in 2019 called Climate Change in the Global Dairy Cattle Sector. And that report told us some really interesting things. It was the first report that had actually reviewed greenhouse gas emissions over a time series. Most studies that come out go, the greenhouse gas emissions from dairy is X. But this one looked at a 10-year period, so 2005 to 2010 to 2015. And in that 10-year period, the emission intensity of dairy, so the amount of greenhouse gas emitted per kilogram of milk or pound of milk, had reduced by 11% globally, which was good news. But at the same time, absolute production of dairy around the world had risen 30%. And so the emissions from dairy globally had risen 18%. And the FAO authors of that report noted that if we hadn't made some of the improvements we were making in dairy around the world, then absolute emissions would have gone up 38%. So we presented that report to GDP's board in late 2019, maybe it was early 2020 now, and they said, well, good news, I guess, that we've got this intensity coming down, but if we, the dairy sector, do not get a handle on absolute emissions in the medium to long term, then it will challenge our social license to operate. The other thing that report highlighted that I don't think any of us had really spent a lot of time thinking about beforehand was that around 80% of the emissions from the dairy sector are coming from emerging or developing dairy nations, dairy economies. So it's not North America, Western Europe, Oceania, North Asia. It's Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, etc. And so part of our Pathways to Dairy Net Zero program is really focused on how do we help those emerging dairy economies to start to implement programs that will see a reduction in emissions. There we worked very closely with the Global Methane Pledge and the U.S. State Department, and they wrote to the ministers of agriculture in 10 countries, inviting them to be early adopters of this program. 9 of them signed on pretty much straight away, and we've already got the first cohort, which is in East Africa, where we've developed a program in conjunction with IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, where we're seeking $400 million from the Green Climate Fund to start a sustainability program for Tanzania, Rwanda, Kenya, and Uganda. And that program is focused very much on, first and foremost, improving productivity, so we lower emissions intensity, improving farm income so that the farmers have got a sustainable future, and then it also has all the nutrition elements to it as well, where more nutrition flows through the value chain.
One thing that I was doing a lot of thinking about as I was traveling around Europe a few months ago was the food security moving forward. You know, we have such a big focus on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions that I saw in a lot of instances it seemed like people were shooting themselves in the foot with future food security versus just focusing on climate change.
Yeah.
What does that story look like in dairy? We increased dairy production, you said, by 30% over that time frame that you were looking at originally, and that's really helping with that food insecurity issue that we have in developing countries. So, what focus should we have on that and helping them in those countries, like you said, increase their productivity so that the carbon intensity of that production is much improved, but still we're improving the overall productivity of dairy globally?
Yeah, there's two or three elements to this that we need to talk about. The first is, let's talk about the domestic production in those markets. And, we often say, you can't pull a lever to reduce greenhouse gases if you're going to create another problem in another environmental dimension like biodiversity or something like that. So you've got to be really careful there. In pulling that lever to reduce emissions, you've got to be careful that you don't harm livelihoods, economic growth, etc., or indeed nutritional outcomes. Now, I should have thrown these numbers at you at the start. There's 133 million dairy farms in the world, according to the FAO, with 600 million people living on those dairy farms, and a further 400 million people whose livelihood depends upon the jobs created upstream and downstream from the dairy industry. So you've got 1 billion people whose livelihoods are tied to dairy. It is the world's largest agricultural commodity by value, third largest by volume. This is a really, really important agricultural and actually industry sector. It doesn't matter what industry it is. Nobody else has sort of that reach and penetration. So when we're at those UN meetings, constantly reminding people of the need to recognize the livelihoods, the economic growth, the social impact that dairy has is really important. But at the same time, we do need to find a way to reduce emissions. And so I often think about this a little bit like the old Rubik's Cube. You've got to solve for all the faces on the cube at the same time. You can't just solve one or two faces and say, haven't I done a great job? So it is a real challenge in those emerging or developing markets. But Paul, we've been running a program in East Africa for some time now, which we call Dairy Nourishes Africa. And we know from that program that we can have an amazing impact on all of those dimensions with relatively basic interventions. And about a year after one of the pilots we ran, we went back and did some analysis of the outcomes that had been achieved and were retained 1 year later. And in that particular pilot, the productivity per cow was still up 25%. The farmer's income was up 29%. The losses across the dairy value chain had been 2 to 7% prior to these interventions. They were now effectively at zero, which is why the farmer's income went up a little more than productivity. And emissions intensity had come down 20%. Now, that was a program focused on nutrition, but nonetheless, we were able to have a significant impact on emissions outcomes. So we know it can be done with relatively basic interventions. We can start to get, quite a major impact and reduction in emissions. So that's the sort of the developing or emerging dairy world. The thing we've got to be really careful about in the developed world is in the rush to meet our nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which are the commitments every country's made under the Paris Agreement. Some countries are saying things like, well, we need to reduce the amount of milk we produce in our country because we're producing far more than we need to consume. Therefore, our emissions are much higher than they need to be. But the crazy thing about that is, those countries are net exporters of agricultural commodities, be it beef or be it dairy or whatever it might be. And if you reduce the production in a country...
Usually because they're really efficient at it, right?
Exactly. And if you reduce production in that country, the knock-on effect is going to be nutritional insecurity in one of the countries that imports from you, ultimately leading to perhaps them looking to grow their domestic production capacity in a country that's not well suited to it. So we've got to find a way to manage what they call leakage. And the fascinating thing to me, Paul, is in the fossil fuel industry, we measure emissions at the point of consumption, not the point of extraction. In agriculture, we measure emissions at the point of production, not the point of consumption. So we're doing a little bit of a study on that at the moment to see what the impact might be, not suggesting a change, just provocatively wanting people to make sure they consider the impacts on nutritional security and other social outcomes of those policy decisions.
So talking a little bit more in depth about the work that you saw in dairy nursing Africa and the impact that had on families and rural communities, could you talk more in depth of what you've seen the impact dairy having on not only in developing countries, rural communities, but even first world developed countries, rural communities?
Yeah, so, I think that's something that we often neglect to talk about, is the importance of dairying in the developed world as well as in the developing world. In the developing world, we can see much more directly, correlation between lifting people out of poverty, reducing hunger, etc. And I mentioned before, we have co-authored with FAO reports on dairy's impact on reducing poverty, dairy's impact on reducing hunger. We've got one coming out in the next couple of months on dairy's impact on improving gender equality. So a lot of that is more focused on emerging or developing markets, but it also has a major impact in the developed world. And, I would argue that, agricultural communities that have got a large dairy component to them are a more vibrant community than those that are largely monocrop, etc. Now, I live in Chicago, and so I drive down south from Chicago to visit my son who's at university down southern Illinois, and I drive through, cornfields and soybean fields the whole way. And you go off the interstate into the little towns that are along that highway, and they are skeletons of their former selves because there's so much mechanization goes into that form of agriculture. By converse, if I drive north to visit my daughter who used to be up in northern Michigan, you drive up through Wisconsin, every little town is vibrant. Dairying brings a lot more people to the community. And when you've got more people in the community, you have healthcare services, you have entertainment, you have schools, you have all the other attributes that go around it. And so tend to be able to tell in parts of the world when you're driving around what the impact is of dairy by just looking at those communities.
Yeah, I think that goes back to a lot of what's the value being created really on a per acre basis, right? What's staying in that community? When you're shipping a bushel of corn from southern Illinois to a port down the Mississippi that goes to China, the value gets shipped with that's going to produce something more than just that bushel of corn. Whereas if that bushel of corn is fed to a dairy cow, which then produces milk, which is processed in that community into cheese, which is then sold, and then you have the byproducts, and there's a lot more value created. And I think that's a story that people around the world don't hear, especially consumers, is what type of value locally dairy has to those communities because of that excess value being created right there.
Yeah, no, I think you're dead right. And as I said before, dairy is the world's largest agricultural commodity by value, third largest by volume. I think it's 14% of all the value add in agriculture is attributed to dairy. So it's a big engine of value creation if we use it properly.
Right. Donald, before we go here, I got a couple more questions. I want to talk to you a little bit more specifically about your career. What's been the most rewarding part of it for you so far?
I absolutely love what I do. My initial career, before the dairy industry was in consulting. And to me, this job that I have now working with the Global Dairy Platform is really like being a consultant to the entire dairy industry, dairy sector. And so I absolutely love it. I find it incredibly rewarding. It is extremely challenging at times as well. As you can imagine, when crises hit the dairy industry, we often get the phone call like, what are you going to do about it? And we're not a big organization. And, we tend to do the work through our members and so on. But there's often, there's people who would like us to help, put together the strategy on how to address those things. And so I find that both exciting and challenging at the same time.
What are some of the resources that you've used over your career that's really helped you? Maybe books or speakers that you've heard to get you to where you are today?
I absolutely love following things like the Harvard Business Review. I spent some time at Harvard a number of years ago. I got sent up there to their advanced management program, and I think the research material that comes out of there and just the way the articles are written is really, really useful. So I'm an avid follower of what they've got in the HBR. But going back a bit, there were some authors that really influenced my early career, people like Charles Handy, who was a sort of a relatively philosopher around, business development and so on. I think some of his work's really interesting. And I can't remember the name of the author, Ira Goldstein or Goldberg or something. He wrote a book called The Theory of Constraints, which I read literally back in the 1980s and I still think of regularly today. And that is, when you're planning an activity, you need to make sure that you have the capacity to deliver on it. And so when I look at things like the Eat Lancet report that came out a couple of years ago, which recommended globally shifts in our diet, the first thing I started to think about was, if you're going to recommend a shift in the diet, can the earth produce the foods that you're talking about in sufficient quantities? And the answer is no, it can't. And so you get into this whole argument about constraints. So you create a diet which is aspirational, because you're telling people this is what you should consume, but then you're limiting access to it. So you're creating an even bigger problem then in the haves and have-nots. So The Theory of Constraints, I think, was just one of those books that has stuck with me right throughout my career.
I think that one's going to go on my reading list. That sounds very interesting. And that's a great application that you used it for as well.
Yeah, it's just, everything that we come across, the number of times people make a recommendation, but they never consider whether there is the capacity to deliver on that recommendation. What are the constraints?
Well, Donald, before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
No, one thing I would say, Paul, and you've been at one of the meetings we ran. We have a dairy ambassador program that we use, particularly when we go to UN meetings, etc. We try and take one or two dairy farmers along with us. When we get farmers to those sort of meetings, the farmers are rock stars, because the rest of us are quote unquote lobbyists, even though I don't see myself quite in that capacity. But farmers are seen as real, and real is important. In a lot of these meetings we're at, there's too many people who pontificate without actually, having their hands in the dirt, if I can put it that way. And so never underestimate the power of farmers to help us change the narrative. It's just, you guys are doing great work. You need to be recognized for the work you're doing. And when we can get you to some of those meetings, you have an incredible impact on changing people's hearts and minds.
If somebody's interested in that, how would they raise their hand?
They can get in touch with me either through our website or just email me direct, donald.moore@globaldairyplatform.com. Most of the people who are part of that program are on leadership groups within their own co-ops or whatever it might be. and we lean on those co-ops to then help fund that, because we're not a big organization with lots of money, so we need help to pull that together as well.
Great. I think that's an extremely important point. I try and make that in a lot of our episodes, and I think many of our speakers that we interview too mention that as the importance of farmers getting involved and making sure that the voice is heard. Thank you so much for being here today and taking some time out of your day. I really appreciate what you do for the dairy industry, and enjoyed getting to know you last October at the Global Dairy Platform Summit. So thank you again, Donald.
Thank you, Paul, and good luck with the rest of your podcasts.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to that interview with Donald Moore. I know I really enjoyed talking with him, and really enjoyed getting to know him last October at the Global Dairy Platform Summit that we had in Chicago that I was invited to speak at. That was quite a great opportunity to meet the big players around the world in the global dairy industry. And as always, if you need to reach out or would like to reach out to Donald, you can contact him. The information for that should be in our show notes. And if you also want to take part in the opportunity that he mentioned in the interview, reach out to him, or probably somebody, if you're part of a dairy co-op, that's heads that up at your specific co-op. As always, we appreciate any ratings, reviews, and subscribing that you do for our podcast, the AgCulture Podcast. And if there's anything that we can do to add value to you, and if you have a topic that you would be interested in hearing on this podcast, please reach out to us. I love communicating, mostly on LinkedIn. I get a lot of comments and interactions with listeners on LinkedIn, and I really enjoy those opportunities to have some discussions and also look at future topics. So until next week, I'm Paul Windemuller, and this has been the AgCulture Podcast.